welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. U.S. officials says Ukrainian forces fighting to take back territory with reports that they have gained ground near the capital, Kyiv.
Ukraine says 9 humanitarian corridors agree to evacuate civilians trapped in Ukrainian towns and cities.
Plus, fierce fighting continues in the center of the southern port city of Mariupol, with over 100,000 civilians trapped there without food, water or heat.
Welcome again. It's day 28 of Russia's invasion, and Ukrainian forces are now fighting to take back territory, according to U.S. officials. Ukraine's forces claim a counterattack north and west of Kyiv appears to have made some headway, and they regained control of Makariv, a town west of the capital.
But the war is unrelenting in Mariupol, where images show more fires and destruction. Here's a summary of the latest from today so far. We'll bring you that report a little later. But VOA correspondent Anna Chernikova joins us now from Western Ukraine. Hello, Anna. The Pentagon says that Ukrainian soldiers are successfully fighting back against invading Russian forces to reclaim ground in some parts of the country. What can you tell us is happening and where?
Quite nice news from the ground. So Ukrainian forces managed to take back certain territory in the Kyiv region, the northwest, as you mentioned, the town of Makariv, which was occupied for certain period of time. Also today, Ukrainian army surrounded the territory of Hostomel, Irpin, and Bucha, which is the main fighting area from the day one of the invasion. The city of Irpin has raised Ukrainian flag back again. So there are quite a lot of improvements in the Kyiv region. Also, Ukrainian forces made improvements in Mykolaiv region, also gained some territories back, as well in Kharkiv region, which also is under very active fightings and attacks, but still a certain territory today, during the day, was back under Ukrainian control.
Also, Anna, reports of the Ukrainian flag being raised again in the suburb of Makariv, west of the capital, Kyiv. What's happening there, really?
It's a territory in the Zhytomyr region, and so it was occupied for a certain period of time, it was a certain base for Russian forces for a certain period of time, and fightings were going on all the time. So basically, Ukrainian forces just moved Russian forces back up north.
So, Anna, we understand there's still bombardments on the city of Mariupol overnight and even up until today. What more do we know about what's happened so far?
Yeah, situation in Mariupol, unfortunately, remains catastrophic in terms of humanitarian part, especially. More than 45,000 people managed to leave Mariupol as of today. Mostly with private cars, private vehicles. All these evacuations are happening under continuous shelling. Humanitarian corridor is not working. Russian forces do not allow Ukrainians to bring humanitarian help to Mariupol. Yesterday, it was an ultimatum from Russian government that Ukrainians should give up Mariupol in order to be able to bring humanitarian help. But obviously, this is not going to happen because neither people nor government will do that. Will agree to do that. So more than 100,000 of people remain in Mariupol. There is no food, no water. I mean, maybe for a couple of days, for a couple of more days, people would have some, some food and water and medications. But medications is actually is a huge problem. So people, unfortunately, are dying not only from shelling, but also from lack of medication and lack of water, especially.
I mean, apparently there's a systemic starvation going on in Mariupol, and those humanitarian corridors not open to the city. So where are the humanitarian corridors open?
There are 9 corridors. One supposed to be from Mariupol, but again, unfortunately, it doesn't work. It works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work for private cars, but not as humanitarian corridor because, again, as I already said, it's under the continuous shelling. Also, there are corridors from Kyiv region, from Kharkiv region, and from Mykolaiv. From Mykolaiv regions, which which needed certain humanitarian help. So people are not evacuating from there, but humanitarian aid is coming. Kharkiv region is partly successful, so some towns were managed to get humanitarian aid, but some towns like Izum, for example, no. So in some areas of Kharkiv region, the situation is similar to Mariupol. In Kyiv, it's much better in the Kyiv region.
Thank you, Anna Chernikova, there joining us from Western Ukraine. Continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
And more now on the situation in Ukraine, day 28 of this Russian invasion or military operation, Russia calls it, in Ukraine. We just heard from Anna about the situation in Mariupol. No humanitarian corridors open there. Images have been showing fires and destruction all over the town. Here's a summary of today's update.
Ukrainian officials have struck a deal to try to evacuate residents besieged in Ukrainian towns and cities via 9 humanitarian corridors. The agreement does not cover the besieged southeastern port city of Mariupol, but includes routes out of Luhansk, where a ceasefire has been announced. Fierce fighting is continuing in the center of the southern port city of Mariupol, which is under an intense Russian bombardment. The Ukrainian government says around 100,000 civilians are trapped there without food, water, or heat. But according to U.S. officials, Ukrainian forces are now fighting to take back the territory.
What I would tell you is, though, that we have seen indications that the Ukrainians are going a bit more on the offense now. They have been defending very smartly, very nimbly, very creatively in places that they believe are the right places to defend. And we have seen them now in places, particularly in the south, near Kherson. They have tried to regain territory. Again, we don't have great fidelity of tactical movements, but we have seen them make these efforts. And I would tell you, Bob, I mean, it's not the Ukrainians themselves several days ago said that they were planning on counterattacks, and so I think we have seen indications that they're moving in that direction.
Ukraine's forces say a counterattack north and west of Kyiv appears to have made some headway, and they regained control of Makariv, a town west of the capital. But the capital has been hit by fresh attacks.
From beginning, in our hometown, Russians killed 264 civilians. We listen bombing attack right now, it can be more. From 264 civilians was 4 children. Right now, over 300 people in hospitals, they is injured. And 16 children also injured right now in the hospitals. Around more than 80 buildings is destroyed.
4 weeks into a war that has driven a quarter of Ukraine's 44 million people from their homes, Russia has failed to capture a single major Ukrainian city. Ukraine's military claims that Russian troops are demoralized and Russian officials are now attempting to recruit former soldiers to join the war effort. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Russia could use nuclear weapons if faced with what he calls existential threat. He also says the deployment of a NATO peacekeeping mission to Ukraine would be very reckless and extremely dangerous. And in a video addressed to Japanese lawmakers, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Japan for its immediate support of his country and urged Tokyo to apply more pressure on Russia to help restore peace. He also warned Japanese lawmakers of reports that Russia was preparing a chemical weapons attack against Ukraine. Shortly after Zelensky's speech, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said he plans to unveil more support measures for Ukraine and strengthen Tokyo's sanctions against Russia at a G7 meeting in Brussels. And on the diplomatic front, President Zelensky describes talks with Russia as confrontational and says that step by step, they're moving forward.
Now we're hearing that Putin's initial aim was to overrun Ukraine and depose its government, ending for good its desire to join the Western defensive alliance NATO. According to the Russian government, his goal was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine to protect people subjected to what he called 8 years of bullying and genocide by Ukraine's government. He said, "It is not our plan to occupy the Ukrainian territory. We do not intend to impose anything on anyone by force." He claimed that this was not even a war nor invasion, merely the fiction of a special military operation that Russian state-controlled media are required to adopt. But now not everyone is convinced that Russia is negotiating in good faith. Several Western nations have warned that Russia is using them as a smokescreen, while Ukrainian presidential advisor Alexander Rodnyansky says the talks are a trap to distract Western attention from the continuing bombardment. But Ukraine's requirements are clear: a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian troops, but also legally binding security guarantees that would give Ukraine protection from a group of allied countries that would actively prevent attacks and take an active part on the side of the Ukraine conflict. Well, joining us for more on this is a senior associate, Olaninwajai, LP, and fellow Programme for African Leadership at the London School of Economics, Michelle Agatishe. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
Thank you very much, Millicent.
Michelle, do these talks serve any purpose? From your angle of things, is there any progress, real progress taking place?
Well, I think two things. First and foremost, talks always serve a purpose. It is heartbreaking to have to see people dying every day, and to the extent that we don't want a war of attrition going on for months and months and possibly years with souls lost, talks serve a purpose. As to whether those talks have so far served a purpose, that's a different ball game. I mean, there have been times when the Russian delegation has affirmed, or rather stated, that there will be a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes, and those ceasefires have not been met. There have been times when there had been prospects of an agreement or some form of peace being reached, and those have not been met. And we see day by day that it appears that between the Ukrainians and the Russians, there hasn't been an opportunity to come to terms, or rather to come to an agreement in respect of what the red lines are. So those are the two things. Talks are critical, talks are important. As to whether the talks have reached their objective so far, I would say no.
So perhaps no sincerity. If we break down a little bit what the parties have put forward, for example, the format of the talks. Do you think that they could lead to a ceasefire? Some have said that, on the one hand, we do not have the capable representatives on the two parts, Ukraine and Russia. In fact, one expert said that perhaps generals are not even there. If we're talking about an immediate ceasefire, then generals who are in control of the war, the military strategy on both ends, need to also be part of the negotiation.
Well, as I see it, I wouldn't say that I have, should I say, foundational problem with the current format. Yes, the generals are important, but with the way that militaries across the world operate, militaries listen to what the political leadership, be they democratic leadership or otherwise, dictates to them. So first and foremost, it's about ensuring that the key decision makers on both sides of the table are those who are meeting. Thus far, we have seen that there have been senior government officials from both sides of the table, on the Ukrainian side as well as the Russian side. But to my mind, I believe that in order to have real solutions, you need to have decision makers at the table. You need to have your Sergei Lavrov, for example, the foreign minister of Russia, sitting across the table, because to a large extent, he has the ears of Putin. I also hear that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has demanded, or rather sought for a meeting, a direct meeting between himself and President Putin. Now that's critical. Why? It means that it is not the case that you reach a decision at the meeting and you have to go back either to the Kremlin or either to Kiev to get political blessing for those solutions that may have reached or the agreements that may have been reached. The second and critical reason why that's important is because both parties are able, right, to get to the heart of the issues, and to the extent that there are red lines that cannot be crossed or there are aspects that can be agreed upon, then of course those can be reached. And finally, the nature of the demands on both parties, or rather on both countries, are things that, to my mind, have to be made from the very top of the political leadership. So, for example, having a neutral Ukraine or having demilitarization, that is something that only the Ukrainian political leadership, right, can actually agree to. So, for example, if you look at what happened in Japan at the end of the Second World War, one of the things that was demanded of Japan was to have a neutral Japan. And Japan had to actually include that within the Japanese constitution. So when you don't have the people at the very top of the political leadership having those talks, then you may have the situation as we have had so far, where you're having talks without reaching a final solution. However, what we have heard recently is that there have been progress, or there has been progress made. The details of that progress, of course, it's of a sensitive nature and we do not know. But I believe that for us to really see an end to this war, or to see some form of peace, right, strained or otherwise in Ukraine, then the people at the very head of the political leadership, being Zelensky and Putin, have to be across from each other on the negotiating table. And just to finalize on format, thus far I understand that the meetings have been held in Belarus, and the Ukrainians, to their mind, have seen Belarus not to be a neutral country for the purpose of these talks. Sometimes they have demanded that meetings be held elsewhere, possibly in Turkey or another neutral venue. This might otherwise seem to just be superficial, that, oh, what does it matter where you have the meetings? But to the extent that you're having non-equality of arms, so you have a Russian side who has the momentum of the war against the Ukrainian side, which is more or less on its knees, ensuring that they're not in a place where they feel duressed to make decisions could be critical, right? And that is one thing that I would suggest needs to be changed, in addition to the fact that senior government officials, if it is not Putin and Zelensky, then at the very least, someone like Sergei Lavrov sitting across from the negotiating table.
Mitchell Agatsisi, thank you so much for speaking with us on the program.
Thank you so much, Amarachi. It was great to be here.
We'll take a short break now on the program. When we return, U.S. President Joe Biden says chemical warfare in Ukraine is a real threat. Join us again. Welcome back. We're still talking Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's day 28. Now, Russia's ambassador to Jakarta says President Vladimir Putin intends to attend a G20 summit being hosted by Indonesia later this year. Dismissing suggestions by some members that the country be barred from the group, the United States and its Western allies are assessing whether Russia should remain within the group of 20. Grouping of major countries or economies following its invasion of Ukraine. Sources involved in the discussions are telling reporters. But Russia was suspended from what was then known as the Group of Eight, the club of leading economists, after its annexation of Crimea in 2014. However, the G20 is a much broader grouping that includes India, China, Brazil and others, and any move to exclude Russia could struggle to find unanimity.
As you know, not only G20, many organizations now, the West, are trying to expel Russia. Actually, what they're doing, the WTO, the custom organization. So what they're trying to do is to destroy the whole trade and logistics system that has been so painstakingly built in the last decades. The question is why? So the reaction of the West is absolutely unproportional. G20 is not a forum to discuss or to solve this kind of crises. Actually, it's a forum aimed at improving or economic situation and solving economic mostly problems, and of course expulsion of Russia from this kind of forum will not help these economic problems to be resolved. On the contrary, without Russia it would be difficult to do so. Russia has been invited to come to G20.
Will President Putin come to the summit?
It will depend on many things, including the COVID situation that is getting better. But so far, yes, the intention is to.
And he wants to come.
Yeah.
To Brussels now, where NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg addressed reporters not too long ago ahead of talks with fellow leaders of the military alliance. Stoltenberg says Russia's invasion of Ukraine is brutal and the human suffering is terrible to watch. According to NATO chief, leaders will agree to the deployment of 4 new NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe, in Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. He says this amounts to a big long-term increase in the military alliance's presence in the region, doubling the existing number of battle troops. NATO members are also expected to discuss the role of China.
Its nuclear. I expect leaders will agree to strengthen NATO's posture in all domains, with major increases to our forces in the eastern part of the alliance, on land, in the air and at sea. The first step is the deployment of 4 new NATO battle groups in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia. China has provided Russia with political support, including by spreading blatant lies and disinformation. And allies are concerned that China could provide material support for the Russian invasion. I expect leaders will call on China to live up to its responsibilities as a member of the UN Security Council, refrain from supporting Russia's war effort and join the rest of the world in calling for an immediate, peaceful end to this war. First of all, any use of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. And it will be a blatant violation of international law and will have far-reaching consequences. And I think that's the most important message to convey.
U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to be at the Brussels summit, which begins tomorrow. He's on his way now to the Belgian capital, where he will be attending that meeting with NATO allies to discuss the response to Russia's invasion. Speaking to reporters just before leaving, President Biden said Russia's potential use of chemical weapons against Ukraine is a real threat.
All I have to say, I'm going to say when I get there. But I'll be happy to talk to you guys when I get back. How many are you coming?
They're there. Do you have any message?
I know.
Do you have any message for Vladimir Putin?
Mr. President, how concerned are you about the threat of chemical warfare right now, that Russia would use chemical weapons? How high is that threat?
I think it's a real threat. Thank you.
The U.S. president asking how many reporters are coming. The reporters covering that event are already there. But joining us now is our Washington correspondent Maria Bird. Maria, great to see you. Once again, President Biden on his way to that meeting in Brussels. He's had a number of them, though. So what does he hope to achieve this time?
You know, President Biden is hoping this time to show some solidarity between himself and the other NATO allies. We know that the U.S. has come out very strong, a leader opposing the Russia-Ukraine war, and also a leader in some sanctions that are just U.S. sanctions being put on Russia. And I think that the question now is going to be, where are the allies? I think the allies are looking for the U.S. To kind of show that solidarity. So I think this is his way of being able to say, listen, we're going to come together. We are united. This is not the U.S. versus Russia or the U.S. providing humanitarian support for Ukraine, but this is the entire NATO community providing support, and this is where we stand collectively.
And that's important, right, isn't it, to not distinguish the United States from NATO, especially at this time. He's also expected to announce new sanctions on Russia. Well, not him. It's NATO that's announcing new sanctions on Russia. Any idea what areas will be targeted this time?
Well, you know, it looks as if what is alluding to is there will be some sanctions specifically on some of the oligarchy, some of those wealthier individuals, so some corporations. So there'll be some very specific sanctions because I think that what we're hearing now is that many of these sanctions are beginning to impact the Russian people. And we know that some of them are not in support of the war. And it's becoming now stated that this is a Putin war versus Ukraine, not a Russian war against Ukraine. So I think that that is going to be very strategically looked at, and the framework for that is going to be developed for those specific sanctions. And then there will be sanctions that will really be not only things that are going to impact the U.S., Russia, and the rest of the world, but it's going to be impact those that are going to coming from the other NATO allied countries. It'll be Poland, it'll be some other countries that will have some very specific sanctions that will be collective in nature. So that's what I think we can expect to see. Now, what the specific sanction will be, I think that President Biden has been very clear that we will not know that until Thursday. I think that he's still in some talks and communication with the allies, and I think he's really focused on making sure this is a united front and that the conversation and that the discussions come out from the entire NATO community, not just the United States.
Also, Maria, NATO and its allies appear to be fighting this war by proxy, and we've heard that they are thinking deploying soldiers permanently, and this is America now, to Ukraine's neighbors. But wouldn't that be considered provocation by Russia?
You know, I think that when you talk about deploying them to the allies, I think that that is really looking at, you know, staying true to the messaging, which the messaging has been, this is not going to be a U.S.-Russia war. This is going to be the entire, and that they're going to support the NATO allies. So I think that's really what that is saying. Now, you know, I do think that we might be a little surprised as to what comes out of the Thursday meeting and what we might potentially see in that area. But I do think that it's really a focus on not allowing the U.S. to go too deep in a war that could potentially end up being viewed as U.S. versus Russia.
Maria Bird in Washington, thanks again. I want to bring in now team lead next year SPD, Dr. Ndwokolo. He is in Birmingham. Dr. Nwokolo, thank you for joining us on the program today. And I want to begin with some of the latest on the Russian-Ukraine conflict, one of which is NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announcing NATO leaders agreeing to deploy 4 new NATO battle groups in eastern Ukraine. He mentions Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. This will be long-term. What do you think about this, that NATO anticipates this war not going to be over soon, or the need to forestall Russia's moves in the foreseeable future?
Thank you. I think it's both. First, we all understand that one of the aims of NATO is to come to the aid of any of their allies in case of an attack or a threat of an attack. So what NATO is trying to do here is to first say, okay, we need to understand that Russia might likely, in foreseeable future, try to attack these allies. So they would want to do that. Secondly, in their head, they might be thinking that this war is not ending now. So it's good we build up a capability around the area. It's equally good for us to understand that this is what we call international relations brinkmanship. So each of the parties are trying to push the other party to an extent where they get what they want. So NATO will do everything to get what it wants, and so is Russia.
Right, so NATO trying to push Russia, but NATO is also discussing China's role in this crisis between Russia and Ukraine. I know we've talked about this before. The U.S. had tried to convince Russia with that phone call that President Biden had with President Xi about Russia making any impact in this conflict. Do you think that China really holds the key here to convincing Russia to pull back from Ukraine?
I love Russia. I love China when it comes to stuff like this, and that's why you remember our discussion last week. I said Africa is not doing enough to benefit from this. China is, sorry, I have to say this. China is a businessman. They know what part will butter their bread. So you could see last week they were saying that they want to see if they can be the team to negotiate between the two parties. So they want to see what they will get out of this. So you shouldn't just think that they will just agree to what the West, especially the United States, will be telling them. They will be looking at what is it that China will get out of this whole thing. So if China thinks that their bread will butter with staying with the West, they will go that route. And if I push the same way, that's what Africa should be looking at now. What can we benefit from this war going on in Ukraine? Can we convince the European Union to fund more of energy resources in Africa and counter what they want to counter from Russia? So there's a book written by John Spencer in 1972 where he talked about the games nation play. This is about games nation play. What can any country get out of this whole thing?
Dr. Nwokolo, Stoltenberg says NATO must ensure the war does not extend beyond Ukraine. What happens if Ukraine is run over by Russia?
I think, for me, I think there's a likelihood, but you equally know that Russia wouldn't want to allow the other NATO countries to come against them. So the brinkmanship will continue. A negotiation will come at a certain time, but I don't think it will extend into those NATO countries. Otherwise, we might be looking at a very strong third world war. But we pray it doesn't get to that extent. But it is a brinkmanship. Each person is looking to see whether there's a very favorable condition to get out of it.
Also, once again, the issue of military aid is back on the table. Already millions of dollars, pounds, euros have been pledged. When we look at what has been budgeted so far, what could that be comparable to in terms of investment into economies, preservation of life, medical research and the likes?
On the part of Ukraine, they are likely to get a lot of aid, especially military aid and reconstruction aid coming to them. Especially if there happens to be a ceasefire, they will get a lot. But I wonder what will come to Russia in terms of aid, because Russia is pushing, its capability beyond what its economy can contain, and the West seems to have understood that Russia might have old weapons, some nuclear warheads, but in terms of economy, it's not doing well. So Ukraine will likely get a lot of more aids going into its reconstruction, medical, and other forms of research and so on. But my fear is what goes to Russia in terms of what you've asked. But when you look at this whole thing, and that's the question one might be asking, why put so much money in terms of developing military weapons and not into other forms of human development?
And we tried to discuss this yesterday, how much really is going, into this war in terms of, the military weapons that are on the ground. Can you give us a sense of, how much this is really costing both parties, how much they're expending on this war?
It's difficult to be able to say that now because the cost are both direct and indirect. So it's just so much. So if you're looking at how much it's costing, just take for an instance, over 400 Nigerian students or 4,000 Nigerian students left Ukraine. If you look at what their school fees are, in terms of what is contributing to the economy of Ukraine, which they're going to lose now. So we'll be able to start imagining how much Ukraine will be losing.
Dr. Ndwokolo, thank you again for speaking with us. A real pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
And as we move on now, Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow will begin insisting that payments for Russian gas from what he calls unfriendly countries are made in rubles. It's given the Russian central bank a week to find a way of switching these payments away from other currencies. He says the change will only affect payments and that gas will continue to be supplied in line with existing contracts. It's not clear what the impact of this decision will be, but President Putin says the freeze on Russian assets by Western countries has destroyed trust, and his country's economy has been hit hard by sanctions imposed by the West over Russia's actions in Ukraine. And those actions include a move to restrict Russian access to international payment systems.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Europe will end its energy dependence on Russia, but to do so from one day to the next would plunge it into a recession, risking hundreds of thousands of jobs and entire industrial sectors. In a budget speech to Parliament, Scholz struck a more cautious tone on reducing Germany's energy dependence on Russia than some of his ministers, who have left open the possibility of energy sanctions, if only in theory, at this stage. The Chancellor assured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who addressed the Bundestag last week, of Germany's support for his country and said sanctions were hurting Russia. He called for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. He also reaffirmed Germany's commitment to supporting Ukrainian refugees, also saying more money would be spent to cover losses faced in Germany over sanctions.
Well, staying with sanctions, France has frozen nearly 800 million euros worth of assets belonging to Russian oligarchs. Government spokesperson Gabriel Attal, who made the announcement after a weekly cabinet meeting, provided no details. On Sunday, Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said that France so far had frozen some 150 million euros on private citizens' bank accounts with French financial institutions in France and 539 million euros worth of real estate on French territory, corresponding to about 30 properties or apartments. He says France had also immobilized 2 Russian-owned yachts worth about 150 million, and that some 850 million euros worth of Russian assets have been frozen.
La bourse est encore en grande partie fermée et la banque centrale est fortement impactée.
And Poland has expelled 45 Russians with diplomatic status accused of spying. The country's interior minister, Mariusz Kamiński, accuses the individuals of pretending to be diplomats and that Poland is breaking up Russian Secret Service agents in the country. A number of EU countries, including Bulgaria and the Baltic states, have recently expelled Russian diplomats that they accuse of spying. Poland's domestic counterintelligence agency said earlier in the day that they had identified 45 individuals who were involved in Russian intelligence projects that posed a threat to Poland's national security. When we return, Greek child prodigy sends message for peace with piano composition.
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is having a ripple effect on neighboring Belarus. Some Belarusian state-owned enterprises, including the country's forestry department, are planning to send their products to other countries like China. Many of them hope the crisis is resolved quickly.
As the conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues, neighboring country Belarus is feeling the impact as a land-based transport hub between Asia and Europe.
This is not a traffic jam. This is one
Financial and economic sanctions imposed by the EU seems to have disrupted its economy. Trucks were seen waiting in long lines near one of the few checkpoints that is still open to Belarusian truck drivers near the border with Poland. For years, driver Anatoly Miseko has been commuting between Belarus and Poland, but now it is becoming difficult because of economic sanctions imposed by the European Union.
The queue wasn't long before the sanctions. It took us about 3 to 4 hours to pass customs. Now it's unpredictable. It could take 2, 3, or 4 days.
He said that his pay has dropped since the EU approved new sanctions against Belarus for its alleged involvement in the conflict. According to drivers, the truck queue was as long as 15 to 20 kilometers last week, and sometimes it takes the truck drivers days to pass customs. This has a huge impact on Belarus's role as a transport hub in Central Europe. The transportation service, BVT, has felt the pinch. One of the products on the EU's sanction list is timber from Belarus, which accounts for a large portion of BVT's business.
Because of the sanctions, the number of trucks coming in and out is decreasing. We are planning to increase our delivery fees to make up for the losses. These sanctions are making our situation very complicated.
Railway transports connecting Eastern and Western Europe have also been affected.
There used to be 2 container trains coming in, but now there is only one. Trains headed for Asia and Europe carry different products. Trains from Asia to Europe containing miscellaneous products from equipment to daily necessities. Trains from Europe to Asia usually carry foodstuff.
Belarusian exports to Western Europe decline. BVT is looking to the east for business, especially China.
Some Belarusian state-owned enterprises, including the country's forestry department, are planning to work with us to send their products to China. Since the 1990s, 80% of their products have been sold to Europe. Now they are considering transporting them to China instead.
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is having a ripple effect on neighboring Belarus, so resolving the crisis quickly is something Belarusians are hoping for.
From Belarus to Africa, watching the horrors of war emerge in Ukraine over the last month has left many South Africans unsettled by their government's refusal to condemn Russia's military invasion. Instead, South Africa has taken a mediation stand, with President Ramaphosa blaming NATO for the war. And since Russia launched its attack February 24th, President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has maintained a neutral position on the escalating crisis in Eastern Europe, even though most of the world has condemned it. When 193 nations voted on a resolution to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the United Nations General Assembly on March the 2nd, South Africa was part of a minority that abstained from the ballot. Ramaphosa has explained that South Africa wants to see an end to the war, but it refused to support the resolution because it did not foreground the call for meaningful engagement. Well, let's listen now to a track from the Deputy Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, Candice Mashego Dlamini.
Deputy Speaker, South Africa's approach on the Russian-Ukraine matters has been based on the following key principle, which in turn are based on the foreign policy, to expressing deep concern at the violation of the UN Charter and international law, the humanitarian impact and forced displacement of people as a result of war in Ukraine. Recognizing the armed conflict would no doubt result in human suffering and destruction, the effect of which will not only affect Ukraine, but also reverberate across the world. No country is immune to the effect of this conflict. concerned at the continuing conflict and violence in the different parts of the world. The BRICS leaders reaffirmed their commitment to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states and reiterated that all conflicts must be resolved by peace means and through political and diplomatic effort in line with the international law, that is the UN Charter. South Africa continues to support and encourage regional initiatives such as the Minsk Agreement, and we welcome the work of the Normandy format, the Trilateral Contact Group, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. South Africa supports the involvement of the good offices of the UN Secretary General, as it could also make a positive contribution in finding a lasting solution to this conflict. In the search of peace, South Africa supports the resolution process of inclusive talk led by the United Nations Security Council to address all the issues of concern to any of these parties. Deputy Speaker, noting that international action must create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. Greater attention must be paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue and not to take them further apart. The international community should support engagement between the parties in a spirit of compromise while de-escalating tensions, committing them to the cessation of hostilities and building trust and confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, members of parliament, as government of South Africa, we urge all South Africans not to take side on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as this could go against our principle. In addition, South Africa has a good bilateral relation in the both countries.
And more world leaders are still reacting to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has reiterated support for Ukraine, and if freedom had a name, she says it would be Ukraine. Speaking in an address to the European Parliament ahead of an EU Leaders Summit that starts Thursday, von der Leyen said she aims to secure a commitment from the United States for extra supplies of liquefied natural gas for the next 2 winters in talks with President Joe Biden in Brussels. Tomorrow's summit comes at the 1-month mark of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Moscow calls its actions in Ukraine a special operation to disarm and denazify Ukraine. Ukraine and Western allies call this a baseless pretext for a war of choice that has raised fears of wider conflict in Europe.
To the European Union in Kherson, in Berdyansk, in Melitopol, they are waving their blue and yellow flags in the faces of the occupying soldiers. And they haven't stopped, even after Russian soldiers have beaten them and shot some of them down. Honourable members, if freedom has a name, its name is Ukraine, and the Ukrainian flag is the flag of freedom today. And of course, tomorrow I will discuss with President Biden how to prioritize LNG deliveries from the United States to the European Union in the coming months. We are aiming at having a commitment for additional supplies for the next 2 winters. Tonight will mark the first month of the Russian invasion. Since the very first day, Europe has stood united, and let's continue to do so. If there's anything that Putin did not anticipate, then it's our unity, the speed of our action, and our determination. He should be in no doubt that we will stay the course. Long live unity and long live Europe. Thank you.
European Commission President speaking on the support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Pope Francis says war in Ukraine shows that humanity needs to shed a strange instinct of self-destruction and that buying more weapons is not the ultimate solution to any conflict. But Francis asked participants at his weekly general audience to think about all the victims of war, the dead, fallen soldiers on one side or the other, the wounded, the homeless and refugees. Since the war started, the pontiff has implicitly condemned Russia for the invasion, but without naming it. He says the solution to the conflict is to work together for peace, as the Bible says, to transform weapons into instruments of peace.
Finally on the program, an award-winning 9-year-old Greek pianist considered a child prodigy has composed an original score to send a message for peace in the conflict in Ukraine. In a videotaped message which he's posted on social media, Stelios Kerasidis evokes the image of a war zone as he sits in an empty, dimly lit theatre in front of a damaged piano and stool. Both theatre props, of course. With black smears on his face, Kerasidis plays the somber, emotive piece, which is named Anti-War Etude. At the end of the performance, he lowers his head and lights go down, and a sign reading, "Please stop," appears. Kerasidis, who's written his own piano concertos, first performed in public at the age of 3. He's played in venues including New York's Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall in London.
It really evokes the image of a war zone.
Indeed, and an emotive piece there from Kerasidis. Now, before we go on the program, here's a quick recap of some of the latest developments out of Ukraine on day 28 of the Russian invasion. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg of NATO, says the military alliance will approve major increases in the forces deployed on the eastern flank of Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. Ukrainian troops are counterattacking Russian forces in some of the countries one of the areas in the countries we report that they've gained ground to the west of the capital, Kyiv.
A U.S. defense spokesman said Ukrainians were also reversing momentum in some parts of the south, but Russian forces are continuing to bombard the southern port city of Mariupol, where residents have run out of water, food, and estimated 90% of city's buildings have been damaged or destroyed.
An international envoy for Russia's President Vladimir Putin, Anatoly Chubets, has stepped down from his role. The most senior official to resign since the invasion began. President Vladimir Putin says Moscow will be insisting that payments for Russian gas from the unfriendly countries, as he calls them, are made in rubles.
Well, staying with the president, Putin has given the Russian central bank a week to find a way of switching these payments away from other currencies. He says the change will only affect payments and that gas will continue to be supplied in line with existing contracts. It is not clear what the impact of this decision will be.
Finally, Poland says it's expelling 45 Russian diplomats after accusing them of using their status as a cover to gather intelligence.
You've caught up day 28, Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Millicent Walker. Have a good evening.